Welcome to the Furniture History Society podcast. My name is Elliot Sterling.
And I am Catherine Hardwick. We are both coordinators for the Early Career Development Programme.
In this series, we will be talking to an international group of emerging scholars who will be discussing their recent discoveries around the theme of furniture, its design and materiality.
Each episode will focus on an individual piece of furniture from 16th century Italy to Amsterdam in the 1930s.
French designer René Herbst designed this model of chair around 1929, shortly after his research on the creation of metal furniture began in around 1926 at the Salon. This new model became testament to a new industrial style that stood apart from the traditional formulas of office furniture, showing how metal could intervene as a sustainable material. Following on from this, Herbst also developed models of metal seats made with angles and tubes. This chair is one of the creator's first models to have reached a certain degree of success, and will also subsequently be the subject of our fourth podcast episode, where I, Vicky Jenner, interview Kiersten Thamm, a doctoral candidate in art history at the University of Delaware. Hello, Kiersten.
Hi, how are you doing?
I'm fine, thank you. How are you?
Good. I can actually say that I do have a version of my object.
Oh, fantastic. Oh, great.
I sit on it every day.
So, for our listeners, Kiersten is sitting on the object we are talking about, which is fantastic.
I am intimately connected with this object. Through COVID, I've sat on it for probably 8 to 10 hours every day. So almost 2 years now.
Wow. So is that why you've chosen the object?
Well, I chose the object as the subject of my master's thesis, I guess 7 years ago now, and just haven't learned enough about it yet. And so when I moved to Berlin, my partner bought me it's not an original. The originals were made in the 1920s and 30s, but a knockoff, and I'm very grateful. It's been much fun to sit in it and see what it's like to really, is it comfortable? Is it nice to sit in every day?
Is it comfortable?
Joy?
What are the answers to these questions?
So yeah, just a little bit about it. It is made out of tubular steel, and it's seamless tubular steel, which means it's really, really sturdy. There's no seam for it to break. And then instead of like a normal seat and a normal back, it has rungs of vulcanized rubber bungee cords. There's 28 of them. And I mean, I probably studied this chair for a good 5 years before I sat in it. And I was always wondering, am I going to get pinched between the bungee cords? Are they set close enough together or too far apart? I don't know what that's going to be like. But I can report that they are the perfect distance from each other so that you don't actually get stuck between them. They just kind of mold around you as though you are sitting in a cushion. Yeah, and I should also say it's normally referred to as the chaise sando, and the sando refers to the bungee cord portion of the chair. The father of modern bodybuilding, Eugen Sandow, had released, actually probably a couple decades earlier by that time, an exercise equipment using bungee cords, and the chair looks quite a lot like them. The steel is quite shiny. It's normally nickel plated or chrome plated if clients paid a little bit extra. And yeah, as I said, it's quite comfortable.
Thank you. So what do you think the reasoning was behind the nickel-plated metal? Why do you think that was chosen to be the material for this chair?
Oh, that's such a multi-leveled question. First and foremost, the designer, René Herbst, had a very tight connection with the steel industry. He often redecorated the homes of industrialists. He worked for the publicity organ of the steel industry in France, the technical office for the use of steel. And he designed all of their exhibitions and a lot of their advertising copy. And so he had this really deep interest in the idea that, like so many of the designers from the 1920s and 30s did, they thought, oh my goodness, we can revolutionize the world by using tubular steel. It's light, theoretically inexpensive, to produce, and theoretically a social equalizer, right? A way that we can remove hierarchy from the objects that we fill our home with. And so he had this great interest in mass production, in standardization, and in getting hygienic, healthy objects into every home in France. And if he could do that, then he could bring world peace, which sounds maybe a little idealistic, and I think it is, but it's also quite beautiful, especially these days. So that's really where the seal comes from. And as I said, he's interested in modern mass production and standardization. And so this chair that I'm sitting on is one version of 15, actually, some of which could use parts from each other to be constructed within like in a factory setting.
This was designed around 1929. Does that come into play as well? You mentioned before the inexpensive quality of the metal and the fact that René Herbst was trying to really proliferate this model across every household at this time. So is this a reflection of what's happening politically and socially?
So 1929 was kind of a banner year for Herbst and for the steel industry. That's when the publicity organ of the steel industry, the OTUA, was formed. And the steel industry by 1929 had fully recovered the northeastern part of the European territory of France, which is, as you know, colloquially as Salon. And these two regions were really the materially richest regions of France. And so, France lost them. One could say lost them if they ever really had them after the Franco-Prussian War of 1871, and then regained them after the First World War, and then took quite a bit of time to kind of re-ramp up production. The area was quite destroyed during the war, and so it took a little while to get going. So by 1929, production levels were really, really high, and these industrialists were trying to figure out what else can we do with steel.
Was it in demand? Were people buying this?
That's another fantastic question. No, people were not buying this. Certain people were. And so you can look, like I said, René Herbst worked a lot with industrialists, and industrialists indeed bought his furniture and were interested in the steel furniture of his colleagues, such as Le Corbusier, Robert Mallet-Stevin, and Jean Prouvé, and of course, Charlotte Perrien. So this kind of wealthier group of folks who had a material interest in steel production found it, as one would expect, quite revolutionary. They wanted it in their homes. And that really wasn't the case across the board for like every socioeconomic section of France.
So I'm really interested to know that this chair is one of the creator's first models to have reached a certain degree of success. So you were just mentioning that it wasn't really in demand, but it was more successful than other models that he had created. Do you know much more about them?
Yeah, all of the models really followed a lot of the same design principles. Like I said, some of the pieces themselves were interchangeable, and they all had tubular steel frames. Some of them had, in addition to the bungee cord seat and back, bungee cord armrests. Some of them were more technical, or I don't want to say more complex, but I guess that might be correct. They had mechanisms. So there's like, if you think about the modern beach chair today, they of course have some sort of something like a bungee cord or some sort of a stretchy object across them, so they're comfortable without having cushions, because you don't want cushions on a beach. And then they have those mechanisms where you can raise and lower the angle of the back. So there's, Herbst played with those in a couple of the styles. There's two that were rounded, which are quite interesting, and pretty evident why those were not as beloved, right? They're harder to produce, they're more expensive to produce, and they didn't have the same kind of sleek modern aesthetic that the really angular chairs did.
And so is the bungee cord, it's acting as a replacement to upholstery. So it's a design, so it's a design choice to actually replace a textile with this form of what's the bungee cord made of? Rubber bands.
Yeah, it's made of vulcanized rubber that came from what was then called French Indochina. And so it's what we now call Vietnam. And so it came from a rubber plantation. And that's where I think like 98% of all the rubber used in the 1920s in France came from. Herbst wrote a lot about his ideas about hygiene and health. And of course, this is a chair named after a bodybuilder. And so that idea of health really runs through the whole thing. And so he's really embracing popular ideas about, oh my goodness, it's so hard to clean dirt and dust and have to get it out of every corner. And that's what, is bringing all of these illnesses inside of a house, and the outside is dirty. We have to keep the inside clean. And so if you don't have cushions, then you have one fewer thing to clean, but you still want comfort, and that like bodily comfort that brings like quiet and peace and rest. Because the outside is chaotic and scary. We have to like come inside and chill.
So it's really interesting that this chair is in itself tapping into that whole narrative of health, and this is actually preoccupying ideologies in the 1920s. So could you say a bit more about perhaps some of the metal?
Yeah, so the chairs were themselves manufactured in a factory that Herbst owned and operated, and were sold directly through his decorator business. So he had a lot of catalogs, and people could buy one-off objects from him, but also they would hire his services to decorate their home or their office or whatever they had, and then the catalog served as a form of record keeping and whatnot. Most likely, I have tried for years to find a specific address or some sort of information to say this is the exact spot where that factory was, and I have so far failed. So if anyone knows out there where to find René Herbst's factory, that would be fantastic. But my best educated guess is that it did come from that northeast section of the European territory of France.
And do we know whether or not the importation of these different materials, even if they weren't being transported very far, do we know how expensive they were? Because assuming if it wasn't really in demand and it wasn't very popular, they were going to have to be careful with how much the material was costing.
I haven't really thought about the specific like raw materials themselves. The chairs were quite expensive. They were anywhere from, I think, and I would like to double check this, but I think from like 400 francs to 800 francs per chair, which was quite wild for a single chair. And then I don't think that the bungee cords were very expensive, because he didn't have a hand in manufacturing them. He purchased them in bulk in a mass-produced size, and so it looks like he tailored the chair for the bungee cords. Rubber was super cheap, right? There's a lot of histories and really interesting work in the history of the Michelin factory, or the Michelin brothers. And so, yeah, so rubber was widely available. It's quite cheap to produce because it was a colonial exploit. Right? So it's not like they were paying a fair wage to anyone working in the rubber plantation.
And that it's still being used today, the fact that it still has legacy, and now you're sitting on a version of it.
Yeah, like you said, we still see it in kind of random spots today, not only in homes, but I saw it while I was watching Sherlock Holmes on the BBC one day. So,
wow, so it's really expanded into sort of a global scale.
Yeah, and in some ways it always has been, because it was also part of a traveling exhibition organized by the French government and like sent to colonial lands to say this is what quote unquote good French design looks like. And so it's always had those two intertwined aspects where it really there isn't much about it that is actually French. The region where the metal comes from was for a very long time Germany, and the manufacturing and the steelworks themselves were most likely built with German infrastructure when it was part of Germany. And a lot of the folks who worked in those areas, like worked in the mines and worked in the steelworks, were immigrants from farther east, especially the region we now call Poland. And so there's very little actual Frenchness going into the production of the frame. And then of course, like we talked about already, the rubber is coming from a French colony. And so there was this really massive campaign by Herbst and the steel industry to try and communicate that, well, this is a French chair. These are the ideas of France, because in France, we have these traditions of discipline and ingenuity and earlier we expressed Frenchness with ornament and cartouches and really big, cushions, but now we are modern and what is French is the chaise-ando.
Thank you for listening to the Furniture History Society podcast. Join us in our next episode, where we speak to Maud Willett all about the creation of the crate chair, designed by Gerrit Thomas Rietveld in 1930s Holland.